skeptics frequently tell us that the Gospels are anonymous, and as we don't know who wrote them, they must be unreliable. Well, this video is about who really wrote the Gospels. There's a considerable amount of evidence here, and therefore I'm only going to present part of it. But if you watch to the end, you'll see 4 kinds of hard evidence that show that the Gospels were, in fact, written by their traditional authors. So subscribe, hit the like button and the notify, and off we go. So there are 2 possible scenarios which explain what might happen, 2 hypotheses. It's possible that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or by people who were using eyewitnesses as their sources, so people who had first-hand evidence. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that the Gospels were written rather later than that by people who were far removed from the events. These are the anonymous writers that are postulated by the skeptics. And the skeptics make much of the idea that the Gospels are formally anonymous. Now, formal anonymity is a rather interesting idea. It's not the same as anonymity. Most books are formally anonymous. Caesar's Gallic War is formally anonymous. Bart Ehrman's commentaries on the Bible are formally anonymous. Lord of the Rings is formally anonymous. The plays of Shakespeare are formally anonymous. The point is that they don't include the name of the author within the writing. But we know who wrote them. The publishers made sure that we did. The names are written on the fly leaf of the works, and so we know who wrote them. So even though they're formally anonymous, they're not anonymous. Formally anonymous just means that the author doesn't name himself in the text, and so formal anonymity is completely irrelevant to the question of who wrote the Gospels. The other point about it is that the people who talk about anonymous Gospels say they're anonymous because of theories of how the Gospels were written. In order for their theories to work, the Gospels have to be anonymous. Now, that isn't the same as having evidence that says they're anonymous, and I'm going to argue that conclusions should be based on evidence, not on theory. So we're going to look at evidence. We're going to look at hard evidence to say whether the Gospels were written by known people or whether they're anonymous. So what kind of evidence have we got? Well, I'm going to present 4 kinds. First of all, we've got evidence of reliability. We've got things like archaeology, undesigned coincidences, the linguistic evidence, appears in other videos on this channel. And the point is that as the Gospels are reliable, therefore they were written by people who were close to events. Second is external evidence. That's evidence from other people who might have known about the Gospels, and it shows that all of them agree on who wrote the Gospels. Third kind is internal evidence, where we look at what's actually written within the Gospels and see where it points to particular people who wrote them. And finally, we've got the evidence of the date. The Gospels were written fairly early, and they were written while the apostles were alive, and so the apostles would be able to check whether we were attributed to the right people. So let's look at them one by one. Let's start off with the evidence of accuracy. So the argument goes like this: only an eyewitness could produce completely accurate detail when describing what happened, or someone with access to an eyewitness anyway. The Gospels provide this accurate detail, so therefore we have to conclude that the Gospels were written by people who had access to eyewitnesses. So what do we mean when we talk about accurate detail? What evidence have we got for that? Well, there's a whole lot of this evidence. For example, archaeology, where the Gospels describe a place, for example. The archaeologists may have dug that place up. So it's a random set, the ones the archaeologists happen to have found. And we find that the detail in the Gospels is an accurate description of the actual place that we found by archaeology. Now, that wouldn't happen if somebody never visited the place. If they were writing out in the Roman Empire somewhere away from Judea, they wouldn't know what Judea was like, and they couldn't even go and visit it after 70 AD because it'll be destroyed. So archaeology is an important bit of evidence. The names, that's quite an interesting one. If you look at the set of names in the New Testament, of characters in the New Testament, you find that some names are more popular than others. And the ones that are more popular, the ones that really were more popular, in fact, you can show that the frequency distribution of names in the Gospels, in the New Testament in general, matches the frequency distribution of names from things like funerary inscriptions or bits of literature. In fact, it does it better than many people who have tried to do the research and write fiction based on the time, even though they're scholars with much research. Understand coincidences. Again, there's a video about this in this series, and these are little tiny details, irrelevant details in the text, which fit with other independent tiny details to show a sort of underlying narrative that you wouldn't really think about from the main account. Again, these only occur where you've got a reliably reliably made account of events, something you don't find in fictitious accounts. Finally, there's the linguistic evidence. The language basis of the New Testament is exactly what you'd expect from eyewitnesses. It's not what you'd expect from people who are later on making up a story from something that's remote from where they were. Plenty of evidence about this on the channel, lots of other videos that talk about it, so I'm not going to go into any more detail on it than that. What about the external evidence? Well, we've got manuscripts, we've got comments from other people, and Gospels usually start with a title. If you go into a manuscript and look at it, you usually find that there's a title before each of the Gospels. And the important point is that all the manuscripts for every Gospel attribute the Gospel to the same person. Now, we're not just talking about one or two manuscripts. We're talking about hundreds of manuscripts, even thousands of manuscripts of each of the Gospels. And they all attribute that Gospel to the traditional writer. There isn't any variation in that. Now, I have seen people writing, skeptics writing, who say, well, what about all the variation? There's tremendous variation in these titles. That's a bit of a half-truth. Almost every manuscript has the title, The Gospel According to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Gospel according to whoever it is. There are a couple of exceptions to that. The words Gospel is omitted from two important witnesses. This is Aleph, Codex Sinaiticus, and B, Codex Vaticanus, and those two don't include the word gospel. They just say according to Matthew, according to Mark, and so on. And then later on, from the 12th century onwards, not all manuscripts, but some manuscripts add the word holy. So instead of just saying gospel according to Matthew, they'll have holy gospel according to Matthew. And there's one minuscule which says at the beginning of the holy gospel according to Matthew. So the variation, yes, there is variation, but the variation is it just gospel according to, or is it holy gospel according to? And the late manuscripts have the word holy added to them. So the important thing here is that the name of the writer of the gospel never changes. From the earliest manuscript to the latest manuscript, we have the same name for the gospel every time, and it's the traditional writer. Let's look at a couple of examples. This is P75. It's an early papyrus document, end of the 2nd century, possibly just into the 3rd century, which contains a lot of the Gospel of Luke, loses the beginning of it, and it loses the end of the Gospel of John. but it's got most of Luke and most of John in there. Now let's enlarge this bit up here. This is the part of it where we've got the actual titles of the gospel. It puts the name of the gospel at the end and at the beginning. So probably it'd be there at the beginning of Luke and probably be there at the end of John, but we haven't got those pages, so we don't know. But if you enlarge it, here it is enlarged from a different view with a different camera. And you can see that Luke ends up Evangelion kata Lucan. It's saying this is the gospel according to Luke. And the next one begins with Evangelion kata Johanni. The word kata, according to, is a bit indistinct, but you can just about make it out. And it's very clear it's talking about John there. Here it's definitely talking about Luke. So at the end of the 2nd century, we've got a manuscript there which has the names of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John written in. Here's another one. This is P66. It's another similar kind of age for the Gospel of John. It contains just about the whole of the Gospel of John, to a couple of pages missing, and there's a bit worn away at the corners, but pretty much it's the Gospel of John. And again, if we look up here, that's the title. There's an enlargement. And you can see it says Evangelion, Gospel, Kata, according to, and then big first black couple letters are a bit indistinct, but it's Johanni. It's also the Gospel of John. And this carries on throughout. You find that all the manuscripts have this title, and it's always attributed, if it's the Gospel of John, always attributed to John. Gospel of Luke's always attributed to Luke, and the same is true for Matthew and for Mark. So let's think about the dates of these witnesses. The manuscripts there, those two are late 2nd century, almost certainly. They may go on into the 3rd century. You can't be precise when you're dating a manuscript from the handwriting. It hasn't got a date written on it. You've got to say, well, there's a range of possible dates, but the most likely dates are in the late 2nd century. We've also got human witnesses who write about the Gospels and name them when they write them. So here's one, Eusebius of Caesarea. He is writing in the 4th century, but he names the Gospels and writes about how they were written and who wrote them. A bit earlier, Origen, he from Alexandria, moved to Caesarea part of his life. He's 250 AD, and it also names the Gospels with the current names. Bit earlier, Theophilus of Antioch and Clement of Alexandria. These are different places, but they're both talking about the Gospels under their current names. Tertullian, same thing. He's Irenaeus of Lyon. He is very, very insistent there are exactly 4 Gospels, and he names them. We can even go earlier than that, although it gets more difficult. Heraclion, he's a Gnostic. He was considered a heretic, but he identifies the writer of the Gospel of John as being the Apostle John. He's writing a little bit before Irenaeus. We've got Papias of Hierapolis. He writes about the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, and he mentions that John wrote a Gospel. So we've got some picture there. And we've also got things like the Muratorian fragment. We've got Justin Martyr, who says that 2 of the Gospels were written by apostles and 2 by companions of apostles. He doesn't name them, but it fits in with the traditional naming of the Gospels. So we've got a whole load of evidence, and the dates go back quite early on in the 2nd century. Not only that, but we've got the geographical distribution of the gospel, these witnesses to the gospel. So they come from all over the Roman Empire. So I suppose at this end here, we've got Eusebius writing in Caesarea. We've got Origen and Clement who write in Alexandria. We've got Irenaeus who writes in Lyon in France. Then Gaul, of course. We've got Tertullian in North Africa. Muratorian fragment probably comes from Rome. Papias comes from Hierapolis, which is now in Turkey. we've got a great geographical spread for these witnesses. And that's quite interesting, because communication in those days wasn't quite as good as it is nowadays. If the Gospels had been anonymous and people had guessed writers for the different Gospels, you'd expect different people to make different guesses. So you'd expect there to be some variation in the witnesses as to who wrote each of the Gospels. They might agree later on, but while there are separate, isolated congregations with threats of persecution which stop you from easily communicating one to another, you wouldn't expect them all to agree on something like the name given to an anonymous document. But it does. So there we got external evidence for the names of the Gospels. Are we making a good case? Please let us know right in the comments that go with this video. We've got internal evidence as well. The Gospels contain lots of clues as to the identity of their writers. And again, because of time, I'm not going to go through all the evidence for even one Gospel, and I'm not going to go through all the Gospels. I'm just going to look at the Gospel of John and just show a little tiny bit of the internal evidence. So we've got these clues in the Gospels which confirm, and they confirm that they're the writers whose names appear on those Gospels. So let's have a look. Gospel of John ends up with a little passage which talks about who wrote it. It's talking about the disciple that Jesus loved. It says this disciple was an eyewitness. It says he's bearing witness about these things, and he's written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And at this point, the skeptics say, hang on, we got this word, we. Who's the we? If it's the disciple that Jesus loved that wrote the gospel, who is the we who appears here? And it looks quite odd to start off with, until you realize that John's gospel was dictated. It wasn't written by John with a pen. John wrote it. He was the author of it, and he did it by talking to somebody else, and that somebody else wrote down what he said. You've got evidence of this in the gospel. So there we've got a passage from John 4, for example. I've done it from the ASV because it's a more accurate translation. It's a more word-for-word translation. And there's this little word, thus, here. So it says, Jesus, being wearied with his journey, sat like this by the well. It's about the 6th hour. And you can understand what's going on. The person who says that is saying Jesus was tired and he sat down, and he then sits down and shows them how Jesus sat. He sat down like this. Now, it may be that he's dictating to a scribe and he's sort of forgotten himself and he's going ahead and showing what happened, or it could be that he's talking to a small audience with someone sitting in the audience and writing down what John says. But the point is that we've got dictation going on. So what we've got here at the passage there where it says we know that his testimony is true, what we've got is the person who is taking dictation, and we have him and maybe companions saying, we together know this chap, we know who we're writing down, and his testimony is true. And it's a common idea that someone wrote it if he ordered that to be written. So when we get the inscription on the cross of Jesus, Pilate says, what I have written, I have written. It's unlikely that he went up there with a pot of paint and wrote on it. He sent someone to do that for him. He didn't actually write it, but they're his words. And that's what's going on here. These are the words of John. They're taken down by somebody else. And here this person is giving evidence that this is indeed John. We can go ahead and we can look at a whole load of bits of evidence. So we can start off, we can say, well, the writer who wrote the Gospel of John was a Jew. He accurately describes many Jewish customs and opinion. He knows what the Jews of Judea thought of Jews from other parts of the world. He knows what they thought about Samaritans. He knows about the expectations of the Messiah. He knows how they behave towards women. He knows about the activities that go on in the temple all the time, and so on. He's able to explain Jewish customs to his readership. So he's Jewish. He's very accurate in doing that. A bit further, we know that he was, not only was he Jewish, but he was a Palestinian Jew. It's a Jew from Palestine. There are lots of places where he describes the places. He describes the pool of Bethesda, he describes the well in Samaria at Sychar. He describes the pool of Siloam, and so on. And when he describes what's going on, the details are accurate details. So he knows these little details. He comes from Palestine. It's been there for a long time. He then goes on to include all sorts of irrelevant detail within the events that he describes. He describes all sorts of things that would be available to an eyewitness that aren't really part of the story, but are important little bits of description. And that suggests that he's actually describing things that he saw himself. And then we can go a bit further. He can describe things in detail that only a disciple would know. He can describe who was sitting where at the Last Supper. We can see that the disciple Jesus loved, that he himself was just in front of Jesus. They're all lying down on their sides. He's the one in front of Jesus, and Peter's the one in front of him. We know that Judas is within fairly easy reach. He knows all sorts of things that are discussed between Jesus and the disciples in private. So we've got a disciple of Jesus, and then what you can do is you can look at the text and you can say, all right, this disciple talks to Peter. So it's not Peter. And not only that, but when the miraculous draught of fishes, there are several other disciples that are mentioned as well as the writer. So gradually you can eliminate other people and you get down to James or John. James, of course, died in the 40s. He was killed by Herod Agrippa. So unless the Gospel of John was written very, very close to the events, very early, then it must have been written by John. And we can corroborate this. We can look at other bits of detail that help to back this up. If you look in the Synoptic Gospels, there are three disciples who sort of stand out from the others. There's Peter. We know it's not Peter because Peter's mentioned as going alongside the writer of John's Gospel. There's John and there's James. Those three are the most prominent disciples, although there are one or two others that are mentioned as well. But John is never mentioned by name in the fourth Gospel. Interesting problem. Why isn't he mentioned by name? Well, the only really reason you can think of is that it's because this is John's account. He doesn't say John did this. He says, I did this. And the person who's writing it down writes down the disciple, the anonymous disciple, the disciple Jesus loved, or whatever. It's very difficult to believe that a prominent disciple like that would be omitted from the accounts because he is such a prominent disciple, because so many things happen with Jesus and John. The only reason he would be omitted is if it is John who is writing the gospel or giving the information that's in the gospel. Another slight point, the word John actually does appear quite a lot in the gospel, but it's always a reference to John the Baptist. Again, every other gospel needs to disambiguate, needs to say this is John the Baptist as opposed to John the disciple. The Gospel of John doesn't have to do that because John is the Baptist and the other John who wrote the gospel is referred to as the disciple Jesus loved. Again, it only makes sense if the writer or if the person who dictated it is John the disciple. So we've got lots of evidence that shows that the writer of the Gospel of John actually is John the disciple. And you can take this on with lots of other little kinds of detail in the other Gospels. Here's an example. Let's compare the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew is talking about the parable of the sower. Just before that happens, we get this little description of the scenario. What's going on? It says Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. And this phrase, the house, equivalent to home, it usually refers to the house of the writer or the person speaking. So Jesus has left Matthew's house and gone down to sit beside the sea, and a great crowd gathers, and he gets into a boat and teaches from the boat while the crowd stands on the shore. If you look at Mark's Gospel, here Mark is the author, the companion of Peter, gets information from Peter instead. Doesn't include any reference to the house. It's Matthew's house. We know that Jesus went there quite a lot. He talks about taxing it with other tax collectors and so on. Peter has his own house. It's not the same house as Matthew's house. And Peter has met them down by the sea. Probably Peter's gone down to the seaside first, and then later on, Matthew and Jesus get there. So it says Jesus began to teach beside the sea. It doesn't include this walk from Matthew's house. You've got this little picture of two different points of view, one from Matthew, one from Peter. The interesting one is when you put Luke in. Luke, of course, wasn't there. Luke gets his information by talking to people, traveling around and talking to people who were witnesses. And he just says, well, yes, there's a great big crowd, and Jesus taught them. He doesn't mention the boat, doesn't mention how it all kicks off. A slight difference between the accounts is typical of different viewpoints from different authors, depending on their particular experience. So we've got a picture of Matthew, of Peter informing Mark, and of Luke, who is informed by someone quite different. The individual details identify the gospel writers for you. And there are lots and lots of those. It's not just the one. You can go on through the gospels and find similar details. Right, the last category we had was evidence of date. And we showed in a previous video the dates for the various gospels, in fact, included Acts in there as well. And you can compare that with the lifetime. We know the lifetime of a few of the apostles. I've got John and Peter down on here. James dies in the 40s, but many of the gospel writers, beg your pardon, the gospel writers also arrived past the gospels. Many of the apostles would survive to the time when the gospels were written. John, the apostle, lives under the reign of Trajan, so he lives quite a long time after the gospels were written. But even Peter lives on. He probably didn't see the Gospel of John written, but he would see Mark and Luke and quite possibly Matthew being written, and other apostles would see more of them. Now, the important point is that you can't believe that an apostle would allow a gospel to be released in his name if he didn't write it. So if John found somebody else had written the gospel and it was being attributed to John, you'd think John would complain about that. He didn't. There's no hint of any complaint anywhere in Christian literature from the 2nd century or at any time at all. So what that means is that there's no forgery around. The Gospel of John was written by John, the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, and so on. The Gospels are written during the lifetimes of the apostles. That is pretty good evidence that they were written by the apostles whose name they invariably bear. So let's look at the sort of logical argument that goes with that. The Gospel was written during the lifetime of the apostles. So the apostles will be able to say, this is an authentic gospel, this is not an authentic gospel. They'll be able to approve the gospel, deny it. No apostle would approve a forgery, a gospel written in a false name. So we can deduce the gospels are not forgeries. They are written by the people whose names that they bear. So the conclusion, we've got four kinds of evidence. We've just seen the evidence of date the Gospels are written during the lifetime of the apostles. We've got the internal evidence. The details in the Gospel match the traditional writers whose names are on those Gospels. We've got external evidence. The ancient sources unanimously agree on who wrote the Gospels. And we've got the evidence of reliability. We've got the evidence of the detail that's included in those Gospels, which shows that eyewitnesses were available to the people who did the writing. All the hard evidence points to traditional writers. So it would be sensible for us to believe that the Gospels were in fact written by the people whose names appear on them. And that's where I'm going to finish. Please take time to subscribe, write a comment in the comments, tell us what you think of the evidence I presented. Look out for the other videos on the channel, and don't forget to subscribe, tell your friends, notify, and if you want to hear the rest of them and don't want to miss them, hit the notify button. So thanks for listening, and may God bless you always.